Let us discuss today the topic Global Political Economy in the Post-Cold War Period. We know that contemporary international political economy emerged as a subfield of the discipline of international relations in order to understand the dynamics between politics and economics in the world state system. Analysis of global political economy initially focused on international security studies, but later on came to involve and amalgamate economic security and the role of various market actors as well as international economic institutions. However, we need to understand that international political economy grew in importance as a result of various dramatic international events such as the collapse of the Bretton Woods International Monetary System in 1971, followed by the oil crisis of 1973-74. Now, we have already studied about the three global economic systems that developed during the Cold War era, and that was the US-led capitalist system, Soviet Union-led communist political economy, as well as the Third World-led Southern political economy. Following the end of the Cold War, international political economy became focused on issues of economic globalization, including issues such as viability of the state in an increasingly globalized international arena, the role of multinational corporations in generating conflict, as well as growth in the new global economy, as well as issues of equity, justice, and fairness. Now we can see three visible global trends after the Cold War period. One is a continuation of a competition between rival forms of capitalism and expansion of emerging powers. Second, we find is a pervasive impact of information revolution around the world. And third is a proliferation of international organizations and transnational governance. Now, let us start off with the first impact on global political economy after the Cold War period, and that is the concept of competitive capitalism and state transformation. What is this new form of capitalism that is emerging after the post-Cold War period? With the worldwide competition between communist and capitalist forms of political economy, rivalry and competition between different models of capitalism was occurring among the Western developed countries of the world. Depending on the analysis, the system was categorized in different ways, such as the competition between different financial systems, such as the Anglo-American model of stock market versus continental European models, which relied more heavily on banks to raise money for firms. This was in contrast to the Asian, mainly the Japanese and the Korean model of closed government-industry finances. Others perceived the significant difference in the various forms of capitalism as being the manner in which they provided welfare to their multifarious citizens. The US model provided a minimal welfare state. The continental Europeans had an extensive government welfare state, while Japan provided a very extensive welfare model such as lifetime employment for those lucky enough to be working for key corporations. The Western competition between capitalism students did not provide any winner. Each model had their respective strengths and weaknesses, periods of success and periods of immense economic turbulence. The European system provided broad-based welfare for its citizens but struggled with relatively higher levels of unemployment. The US system generally had lower levels of unemployment but a disturbingly high number of its citizens who lacked basic access to welfare such as affordable health care, which is very expensive. The Japanese economy enjoyed great success till the 1980s, sparking fears among the US economists about a potential rival emerging in the field. However, in the 1990s, it was the US economic system that led to a wave of technological innovations, and the Japanese economy entered a decade of economic stagnation. From 2008 to 2012, both the US and the European economies suffered severe financial crisis. While the US showed signs of a reviving economy around 2015, Europe sustained austerity and economic stagnation. At the close of the first decade of the 21st century, the competition between various forms of capitalism had become global and diverse. The welfare capitalism of Western Europe and the Anglo-Saxon liberal models were joined by a host of competitors and a variety of models. The BRICS countries such as Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they emerged as areas of intense, extensive economic activity and political influence. Firstly, among these competitors was China, which possessed an extensive manufacturing sector and considerable surplus from its export. It combined an authoritarian domestic state with strict internal labor discipline and a mercantilist approach to economic policy through regulation of foreign investment and active intervention in financial and production systems. Now, we all know that China enjoyed tremendous growth but struggled to disperse gains amongst a large and diverse population. What about India? India pursued a different model altogether. It maintained a democratic government with leading sectors in information technology and services, but faced a substantial challenge in transforming a large subsistence agriculture sector and developing its infrastructure. So agriculture was a big challenge despite the Green Revolution model. A renewed semi-democratic Russian state imbued with immense wealth from natural resources cast a shadow over the increasingly energy-dependent Europe. However, a collapse in oil prices in 2014 showed the fragility of the Russian resource-dependent development model. In Latin America, Brazil, buoyed by reinvigorated industrial and agricultural sectors and led by governments committed to addressing its horrendous rates of economic inequality, offered an alternative model in the Western Hemisphere. However, we need to understand by 2015, the developmental model was also challenged by slow growth around the world. In South Africa, initial optimistic hopes that a post-apartheid state would lead to an African renaissance wilted in the face of stubborn inequalities and unemployment worsened by premature economic liberalization. Alongside the competition between different forms of capitalism around the world, we also see a change in the nature of the state and the various models pursued by it. Now let us try to understand how the global political economy impacted the state system. The function and nature of states at the beginning of the 21st century are different from those of the state models in the 20th century. In the 1950s, states in the First World were characterized by Keynesian economics or Fordism, which implied the system of mass production as well as mass consumption. They were committed to fostering full employment and cushioning economic turbulence within the internal borders of the country. In the Second World, Soviet command economies marshaled resources to feed industrialization and competition with the West. However, the Third World led to the emergence of developmentalist states which intervened in the economy to protect infant industries and begin the process of industrialization. By 2000, we find that most of the centrally planned states have disappeared completely, leaving the field to different versions of welfare and development states and the competition states. That is the reason why we say post-globalization, we do not find rolling back of the state, but we find a reconceptualization of the state so far as the welfare state model is concerned. Let us move on to the next part of our discussion as to how welfare and competition were entwined in the northern part of the world. Now, students, in advanced industrialized societies, considerable concerns were expressed that both the nature of the state has changed from providing welfare to its citizens to preparing citizens and corporations to face international competition. So, states, citizens and industrial houses were susceptible to face international competition. The idea of a competition state captures this particular dynamic. Cerny suggests that the transformation of the state roles definitely calls for introducing major policy changes. One change is that rather than supporting particular industries or sectors, states are more likely to ensure that national economies provide for a competitive arena. This involves both initiatives at the macro level as well as the micro level. At the macro level, states put priority on low inflation to attract greater investment. At the micro level, steps are taken to increase organizations' competition and capabilities. This might include steps like privatizing industries or changing labor legislations to permit more flexible employment-oriented sectors. Finally, governments are increasingly shifting from maximizing general welfare through policies such as full employment, universal social security programs and other welfare-based programs to targeting programs designed to increase citizens' employability, such as providing them training, reducing their benefits to encourage work at lower wage levels. Therefore, we find that this concept of a competition state is a useful tool to think about policy innovations in the Western states. Now, what about development and political economy in the Global South? Global South, unlike the Global North, focuses on state-led development. Liberal and authoritarian competition in the southbound states outside the development world have not been immune from pressures of the global marketplace. Two developments from the late 1970s and early 1980s have increased economic competition within the developing states as well as among the developing states. One decision was the unilateral decision taken by the government of China that it would begin opening up to Western states and seeking trade and foreign direct investment. This was completely contrary to the communist model of closed state system. Although this was a slow process at the beginning, China grew to become the major recipient of foreign direct investment in the 1990s. This diverted investment from other developing countries and resulted in the growth of exports that competed with the products of other developing countries led to a change in the global economic model. For example, China, India and Indonesia might all be trying to sell the same product in the US market, leading to greater competition within the Global South. The second development was the debt crisis, which forced many states to abandon inward-looking development strategies in search for a global market position. From a different perspective, McMichael describes the change as the abandonment of a national development project to a globalization project which would fit in well with the global economy. So instead of inward-looking development process, developing countries were looking towards creating world markets. This crucial point was that this in turn led to greater openness, greater competition in taking place within a variety of political framework ranging from liberal, democratic to authoritarian ones. Communist China was aggressively courting foreign direct investment in trade but still retains an authoritarian state system that I just discussed. However, 1990 saw a tremendous change in the number of states who democratized themselves, such as South Korea, South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, and continued the policy of insertion into the global economy. So, manifold changes were taking place in the Global South. While many southern states have liberalized themselves, the notion of development state attracted renewed interest in the wake of financial crisis in the western states between 2008 and 2012. Western countries seem to have suffered from excessive liberalization and deregulation of their economies, whereas states that kept financial sector subservient to developmental goals such as China did relatively well post 1990s. Now, there's another very important concept that is coming up in this global political economy is the rise of offshore regulation. Now, what is offshore regulation? Offshore regulation refers to areas in the global economy where states create territorial or juridical enclaves characterized by the reduction in regulation. This is a very interesting phenomena. One of the most significant developments in the offshore world has been the growth of tax havens or areas where tax concessions are provided. Tax havens are usually located in small states such as the Cayman Islands. They allow companies and banks to move large sums of money through paper companies to avoid taxation and regulation. Some estimate that half of the world's money resides or passes through these particular tax havens. Similar offshore developments can be seen in other economic sectors as well. Different forms of regulations have been applied to specific territories within states to foster investment and economic growth. Many developing as well as developed states have created export processing zones, or which are called EPZs, or these are tax-free zones where investment is considered to be lucrative. In developed countries, these export processing zones are likely to be depressed areas of desperate for economic growth, such as the inner cities or tier 2-3 towns. What all these areas share is a different type of economic regulation applied to them than the rest of the country. There is another important phenomena which is coming up is the rise of special economic zones, which also provide for various tax incentives to the companies investing there. The rise of this new political jurisdiction in the form of offshore revolution provides some business actors with greater economic flexibility to increase profits, reducing the cost of complying with regulation. Another important impact of the global political economy in the post-Cold War period is the rise of international organizations. These international organizations can be categorized into three groups: the United Nations, international economic organizations, and corporate and civic associations. The United Nations was formed in 1945 in order to build upon international peace and cooperation. Two institutions within the United Nations framework bears importance in this regard. One is the United Nations Security Council, and the other one is the role of the United Nations specialized agencies. We know that the Security Council consists of 15 members, 5 permanent and 10 non-permanent members. The 5 permanent members form the Big Five, who exercise dominating influence in international governance. Though the United Nations Security Council is essentially entrusted with the task of international security, it also has certain economic powers as well. Foremost among them is the power to impose economic sanctions on recalcitrant nations if they do not abide by international economic regulations. However, besides the Security Council, we also have a host of United Nations specialized agencies performing a number of functions contributing indirectly to the global political economy. For example, we have the World Health Organization, which deals with the global public health. We also have United Nations Children's Fund, which concentrates on improving and providing welfare of citizens. We also have the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which is entrusted with the task of refugee rehabilitation and welfare. In general, these agencies attempt to cope with the casualties of the global political economy. While doing excellent work, they have relatively less power to influence economic structures than international economic institutions in a nutshell. Now, coming to international economic organizations, they provide a multilateral framework which have been created after the Second World War, and they have worked quite well in providing a set of rules and regulations to bound the global political economy. International economic institutions have taken increased significance in political affairs, and these institutions continue to influence the behavior of economic performance of the states. In the wake of the international debt crisis, we find the IMF and the World Bank playing an enlarged role in the global political economy. The relevance of the IMF or International Monetary Fund was underscored during the global financial crisis of 2008-9, where despite some reservations concerning the adequacy of its lending capability and strength of its surveillance mechanisms, it was given a central role in coordinating responses to the crisis. The financial assistance and policy advice of the Bretton Woods institutions have been critical in dealing with the states in financial crisis. In return for assistance, these institutions have demanded that states adopt various adjustment policies by liberalizing their economies and opening up to trade and international investment. A very notable an important feature of the post-Cold War global economic world is the formation of the World Trade Organization in 1995. It is a significant change from the GATT era because it provides the trade regime with a permanent institution, opens up new areas of economic activity, and most importantly, it provides for a dispute settlement body. This dispute settlement body makes it a unique organization in order to reconciliate and resolve disputes among the conflicting trading partners. Despite the long drawn-out Doha round of trade negotiations, governments appear unwilling to contemplate the collapse of the WTO. For most of the period post-1990s, these organizations have enjoyed the support of the leading states of the world economy. Successive US administrations, European Union countries and Japan have times pushed specific agendas that weaken one of these various regimes, but they have continuously provided support for a renewed and reinvigorated multilateral trading framework. In other words, the post-war consensus of the necessity of an open multilateral economic system has been eroded despite the shifts in economic policy. However, we need to note that the rise of BRICS has heralded a demand for increased influence in these organizations, and there has been no threat to the existence of these organizations. The post-war multilateral framework will have to adapt to a changed power structure, but the precise form of new multilateralism that is going on currently is becoming very popular. The increased influence of these institutions can be seen in the growing power of these institutions in controlling international economic trade. The IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organizations are the most visible international economic institutions, but there are very many others also. The Group of Eight, which brings together the most advanced industrialized economies and Russia to discuss economic management of the global economy. In the wake of the global financial crisis, the group of G20, which had traditionally focused on financial issues such as financial stability, has widened its scope to more general economic matters. It includes the G8 plus a number of prominent developing countries. The Bank for International Settlement, located in Geneva, is considered to be a central banker for these institutions. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is popularly called OECD, is an advisory organization that brings together industrial countries of the world. Now, coming to the next part of our discussion is the role of corporate and civic organizations. Corporate and civic organizations refer to both for-profit and not-for-profit organizations which are playing a very important role in the popularization and acceleration of progress in the global political economic system. Bali and Thomas estimate that almost 60% of international non-governmental organizations, that is NGOs, are concentrated in economic or scientific fields. NGOs have been particularly active in international development. In the 1980s, Western governments increasingly used development NGOs as a channel for the provision of economic aid, Not-for-profit citizens organizations have also increased their international presence and have created international advocacy networks to lobby with transnational corporations, multilateral economic institutions, as well as governments of various nation states. This activity has been enhanced because of the revolution in information technology, which enables all these activists and non-governmental organizations to build networks across countries. The anti-globalization protests and meetings of the WTO, World Bank, IMF, to name a few, are evidence of the growing importance of non-state actors in international economic policy making. In some areas where states have not set up appropriate regulatory institutions, industries have formed their own associations to bring about some form of rules and regulations. We are aware of the ISO 14000 set of regulations, which are very, very powerful in the area of environmental standards. We also need to give emphasis to the role of industrial associations in the construction and maintenance of global governance structures around the world. While industrial associations internally have played a very important role within the country, in international political economy, these international industrial associations are also gradually gaining ground. So what have we learned from the role of the global political institutions in the post-Cold War period? One important position that we can see is that the state has not withered away in a globalized world. We can see the viability of the state and the reconceptualization of the state in the global political economic framework. We also find the leading role of multinational corporations and transnational organizations in strengthening growth in the new global economy. Finally, we also see the rise and role of international organizations, intergovernmental organizations, NGOs, and transnational organizations influencing global political economic policy framework. Thank you.